Forward.
Okay. Everybody can see just fine.
Looks good.
Okay. All right, so I titled this presentation Lower Deschutes River Demystified. And why I call it that is because when I was in Sunriver and, you know, of course, interacting with a lot of the folks in the club and the locals in Sunriver, I always heard a lot of people talking about the Deschutes, like, you know, I guess there was a stigma around it about, you know, it was hard to wade and dangerous and whatnot, and you know the fishing's tough and blah blah blah. So I'm going to go over some of those points, but also just talk about, you know, the kind of prime fishing tactics and basics and everything. So Lower Deschutes introduction. The lower river is what we classify as everything from Pelton to the Columbia River. And so that's the lower 100-mile stretch. And, you know, it's a lot of, there's always a lot of confusion about what the different sections of the river are, but that's the true lower from Pelton Dam, basically the Warm Springs, Madras area down to the Columbia. The river's home to several native game fish. Redside rainbow trout is going to be our primary focus tonight, as well as bull trout, mountain whitefish, steelhead, and a few different species of salmon. You can fish for trout year-round in the Lower Deschutes, and I think that's something that slips through a lot of people's radar, is that the upper stretch of the lower river, so basically Warm Springs to the northern boundary of the Warm Springs Reservation, is only open from April 22nd to December 31st, which is still a big chunk out of the year. But from the northern boundary to the Columbia is open all year. So, you know, technically you can go down to Maupin or, you know, even down around the mouth, you could fish for trout right in the middle of winter, and there's still some really good fishing to be done. It's a larger river. The average flow at the Madras gauge is usually around 4,200 cubic feet per second. So substantially larger than the Deschutes that everybody knows up in Sunriver. You know, that's going to be like peak flow around 18 or 1900 cubic feet per second in the summer when they're drawing irrigation. So I apologize, this is the best picture I could find that describes the segments, and this isn't real important to know about unless you're going to be floating the river, and then in which case you need to kind of know the different segments for your boater's pass. But segment 1 is really from Warm Springs all the way down to Maupin at Harfin Flat Campground and boat launch, and then from Harfin to Sandy Beach, which is just above the falls, is what they consider segment 2. And then 3 is Buck Hollow to Max Canyon, and Max is the last access point before it goes into the lower 25 miles of river, all the way down to Heritage Landing, which is at the mouth, where the river then meets the Columbia. So lions and tigers and bears, oh my. I wanted to talk about some of the preconceived notions that people have about the Deschutes that I've found just talking to people. You know, and usually fishermen exaggerate, so they always like to exaggerate the truths around the Deschutes as well. You know, so one is that it's riddled with rattlesnakes, and that's just not true. I spent a good amount of time down there last year, like half my season was on the Lower Deschutes River, and I encountered one rattlesnake. So they're around, but there's days where I went to the Crooked River and saw 4 in a day. So it's not anything to worry about. Slippery and hard to wade. There's some truth to that. There are sections where there's some really large boulders and they're all round and slimy, but honestly, most of the spots that we fish, you're either ankle deep on the bank, or there's like nice calm cobbly style gravel bars, no different than any other river that you're going to see around here. The crowds can be kind of brutal during the stonefly hatch, but honestly, by second week of June, they're gone. And then like late April and first week of May is one of my favorite times to be there, because it's opening week. There's really hardly anybody on the river. There can be some great hatches, and crowds are kind of relative to whatever you're used to. This is also a huge river, and there's so many little places to fish and hide that a few extra people on the river is not a big deal. Complicated licensing is another myth that I hear about. You can just have a regular old fishing license. Oregon State fishing license will cover you for the good majority of the river if you're fishing for trout. On the Warm Springs to Trout Creek section, if you did want to fish on the west side of the river along the reservation from Dry Creek to Trout Creek, there's a 7-mile section. You can get a tribal permit and fish the other side through that space. Rapids, yeah, the Deschutes has a reputation of having large rapids, but that's really like, there's only a few really big ones to be scared about. And the splash and giggle sections, as I like to call them, and most of those are down in Maupin. The multi-day stretch from Trout Creek to Harpham, there's White Horse and Buckskin Mary, but they're just rapids. It's not a big deal. There's plenty of river without any. And also there's no bugs, there's no mosquitoes. I wanted to put that in there just because it's like, as a former resident of Sunriver, it sure is a relief to go out to the desert and not have anything buzzing around you or trying to carry you off. So let's talk about the approach to the river a bit, just where to get started. The recommended equipment, your typical rod and reels are your 5-weight would get you by in almost every scenario of fishing for trout on the Lower Deschutes. I do throw 4 weights for flip and dry fly fish and back eddies and stuff, or places where I know I can get away with fighting them. The currents are a little rugged and the fish are really hot, so having the ability to have a little more leverage and turn the fish around is good. So, and also like being able to throw more line and flip heavier flies. So sometimes a 6-weight can be a good way to go. Your standard weight forward floating lines is what you're going to use in most practices. Kind of a heavier aggressive taper for turning over longer, heavy nymphing rigs or big dry flies. I suggest the Rio Grande, but I just mostly fish Rio lines. Like SA makes some great stuff. I think like the Amplitude line is just like one of the better lines that's out there right now. Classic 9-foot 4X 3X leaders, you can always tinker with these and shorten them, add line, whatever. That's kind of where I start those, like with a 3X leader, and I build off of it. So tippet, you want your nylon standard tippet for fish and dry flies. I always fish fluorocarbon when I'm nymphing down there. I think it's a huge advantage, especially when the water's been lower and clearer in most of the places that we fish these days. Like fluoro is the way to go anytime you're subsurface. So studded felt wading boots are an absolute necessity. Just give you more confidence walking around and for safety. I know a lot of people worry about felt and transferring aquatic invasives, but that's kind of the duty of the angler, to be responsible and to clean your equipment when you're done. And don't just put your wading boots on the next morning and jump into another river system. You should go home and rinse it off if you fish in a place like the Lower Deschutes that has some invasive species in there. A good sturdy wading staff, so important, and good sun protection. There's not a whole lot of places to hide from the sun down there. There are some trees and stuff along the bank, but it's the desert, so it's pretty exposed. Anyway, moving on. Some safety measures you guys can take. It's a large river, like I said. It's 4,200 cubic feet per second, and so there's plenty of good places to wade, and it's perfectly safe as long as you are using common sense and thinking about where you're going. And like the suggested equipment, using a wading staff and felt studded soles are an absolute game changer. And the biggest thing about the wading staff is you have to use it to make it helpful. Couldn't tell you how many clients I take out fishing and they have a wading staff on their hip and they slipped into the river. And I think that, swallow your pride and pull that thing out and poke it around in the gravel. So it's a good way to go. Again, the studded felt wading boots, fishing with a partner, fishing with a friend, having somebody there when you're out on these larger rivers is a really good idea. Maybe just to act as your conscience and tell you that, hey, don't go down that slippery bank towards the back eddy. Like, let's go this way. Another good safety option is hire a guide. You can take somebody like me, and I row the boat. I hold the boat against the bank when you get out. I will extend my arm to help you wade out to a spot and eliminate a lot of the unsafe practices that you may naturally do when you're fishing by yourself. Okay, as far as walking wade on the river, there are a ton of foot access spots on the Lower Deschutes. And, again, I think this is one of those reputations on the river is like, people think that you need a drift boat to fish it, and it couldn't be less true. Most of the people that are probably watching this right now have driven to Portland from Central Oregon on Highway 26, and you cross the bridge there at Warm Springs, and that is where I start all my day floats, right there at the Warm Springs Bridge. That little mile-long section along the river there's some fantastic trout fishing. A lot of the time I start my trips at the boat launch and I just hop people out at the island right there and start fishing. We pick up trout right at the boat launch. Right below there is Mecca Flats Campground. It's about 1.5 miles downstream, and that is the trailhead from Mecca Flats all the way down to Trout Creek. There's a 7-mile section that you can walk the whole bank. There's a trail the whole way. Plenty of foot access. People do it all the time, and there's lots of places to spread out to. So it's a good choice. You can also drive to Trout Creek and walk upstream from there and come in on that trail from the other direction. And then there's South Junction, which is a little bit longer drive. You go all the way down to the junction of Highway 97. It's usually pretty secluded down there, with the exception of steelhead season that can get a little busy, but another great foot access point. And then the Maupin area, there's 34 miles of road along the river that you can drive and park, and you can keep yourself really busy fishing down in Maupin just from your car driving up and down the road. Day floats. Floating the river gives you access to both sides of the river, as well as getting around the islands and there's a lot of little hidden gem gravel bars and benches that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get to. So it is a huge advantage to take a boat. The best day float sections, like I said, I work Warm Springs to Trout Creek a lot, and that's a 9-mile section, so it's a good full day float. The Warm Springs to Mecca Flats campground is a kind of a sweet little 2-mile float that I do as a half-day trip. It's a good way to go out and like experience the evening caddis hatch without committing to doing a whole day on the river. Or if you find yourself limited on time or you just don't want to commit to doing the whole thing. Maupin area, there's a few different day floats. Nina to Wapanisha is one of my favorites. You can do Harfum to City Park, but you have to go through class 3 rapid at Boxcar, and also Wapanisha Rapids, which is probably not something most of you want to do. And then Pine Tree to Beaver Tails, another really gradual, like mellow flow. There's no rapids or anything. It's just mostly just little wave trains and bouncy riffles and stuff. It's really mellow. So let's see here. Oh, chat thing. Oh, really? You're making hot chocolate. Okay, we'll see you. Anyway. So the multi-day floats, the multi-day float that I do for the most part would be from Trout Creek to Harfum Flats or from Warm Springs to Harfum Flats. And that's a 3 to 4 day float. So you're committed to doing 2 or 3 nights. And you can really get into some less pressured water and some unbelievable scenery. It's like, it's so beautiful down there. The river drops through a stretch that they call the Mutton Mountains, and that's where White Horse Rapids is at the head of that. But the cliffs and the overall landscape is just absolutely stunning. So we're usually cooking some amazing food on these trips too, and it's just a good way to go out and kind of get immersed in the true wilds of the Lower Deschutes. And you're also like, you're sleeping on a cot with a nice, comfortable, big, thick sleeping pad. You're up off the ground. We got all the basic comforts of home, cushy chairs and, usually fireplaces and things like that when they allow it. And it's really a good time. These two smiling gentlemen in the photo are Bob and John that I had out on a 4-day float last year. And I chose this photo because I just wanted to point out these guys are both in their mid to late 70s. And they somehow survived and popped out on the other end. We caught a bunch of fish and had a good time. So don't be scared to, go down the river on a multi-day. The Redside trout, let's talk about them for a bit. They're the rainbow trout of the Deschutes, and they're known as Redsides due to their distinct red stripe down the side. They're a variation of the native red band trout that we find all over Eastern Oregon. These are the same fish you guys are going to find in the Crooked River and the Upper Deschutes as well. I think the genetics of the Upper Deschutes rainbows are a little muddled because of the stocking programs and stuff, but these guys are true. They're true tigers. They're just wild fish. They're crazy. They're the dominant species in the Lower Deschutes. They're definitely the dominant catch. They thrive in the nutrient-rich waters of this tailwater. The Lower Deschutes is a tailwater too. It's very consistent flows, consistent cool temperatures, and just great trout habitat. These fish have a reputation of being very aggressive, making explosive strikes, and big runs. We see our backing a lot on the lower river. So even a 14-incher or something can just absolutely tear you up. The average fish is in the 12 to 16 inch range, but we've definitely caught fish that were pushing 21, 22 inches down there. And those fish are just outstanding. So where we find them, the Redsides, they thrive in faster, more turbid, oxygenated waters. And so, rather than, your typical trout water, they do hang in that stuff, but they have this uncanny ability to like hang on some of the fastest currents where you'd think that they wouldn't be able to live. They're often found in riffles and gravel bars. Riprap seams and back eddies are some of my favorite structure points to look for. Typically preferring the more rugged portions of these lies, and so they'll sit like right in the deepest churning part of some of these runs. Especially the larger fish, I'll usually pick up my biggest fish in a spot when I'm, move the indicator up, we add more weight and punch it out there into some boiling spot. So I drew a couple diagrams for you guys. This is my diagram of the riffles and gravel bars. And so what you'll see here is you have your overflowing current. And I wanted to show here in this example too that a lot of the gravel bars and benches on the Lower Deschutes will have like multiple troughs to them. They'll have kind of a rippled effect. So you'll have a gravel bar bench followed by another bench followed by another bench, and then a big drop off at the back end of it. And so there's some gravel bars where I might stop the boat on 3 different benches going down that thing and fish all these little troughs and pick up fish in every one of them. So it's a really fun way to fish. And again, like some of these gravel bars, the water's like just roasting over the top. It's just cooking along the top, and they're pinched in there somehow. The seams and riprap banks, the Lower D has got a lot of like really steep rocky banks on it, and not necessarily always steep down to them, but once they reach the river, they can be rather a steep drop off the bank. And I'll find these fish just pressed right up against the rocks. And so when you find a little hump in the rocks, like you see here, that will create a seam and just like a little current break on the downstream side of it, and those fish will tuck right into that stuff. This is really good water to fish. If you're doing some Euro nymphing, kind of drop shotting, fishing heavy rigs along those slots, they can be kind of boily. So sometimes a strike indicator rig can draft off of the spot where a Euro nymph rig, you can kind of punch in there and drag it through and fish those a little more thorough. So the back eddies, the Deschutes has got some really immense back eddies on it, like really, really big ones. And I will find fish all through these back eddies, but the majority of the fish are going to sit right down in the pinch point where that water recirculates back into the main current. And oftentimes I'll find a bunch of fish stacked up right on those pinch points where that current turns back into that thing. And again, these are kind of deep boiling spots. And sometimes I'll just let my line kind of feed back into the main current, and right as it makes the turn and gets sucked out, is when you just get slammed by a fish down there. So these are great dry fly spots too. Little calmer waters up along the head of the eddies and along the side channels of them. So those fish will often like kind of pull in there and sip. All right, lower D fly fishing tactics. Basically, every tactic, in fly fishing has its application on the lower river. They're all productive. I'd say 99% of the time I'm just doing some standard nymphing under a strike indicator or dry fly fishing, and we do a lot of dry fly fishing down there. Usually some kind of hatch or some kind of little shade pocket where you'll find fish rising to caddis, and they'll also just randomly come up and smack big attractor dries. We'll go over that a little bit more. But here's the standard nymphing rig that I do on the left here, and that is it's your generalized nymphing setup, your regular tapered leader, down to your first fly. I typically will fish a larger fly up top, like say a stonefly or something, and I'm attaching that to 3 or 4x tippet. Generally I'm using BB split shot on the lower river. I will go down to like number 4s and number 6s when I'm up in some shallow riffles and whatnot, but for the most part, most applications, I'm throwing some heavy shot. And so two BBs will get you through like most of the big heavy choppy riffles and stuff. And then you can throw a dropper off that fly, usually using like 4x fluorocarbon. About 16 to 20 inches is pretty regular. As far as your indicator choice, I forgot to make a note about that, but just make sure you bring some bigger, more buoyant indicators when you're using that much weight, and you're fishing it in heavier waters, like maybe a half inch or a 3/4 inch thingamabobber is a good choice, just so it stays up on the top and you can see it. Drop shotting is another technique that I use. That's the diagram you'll see here on the right. And this is a good way to kind of get your flies punched down a little quicker. Having that shot at the bottom really helps them descend. And it's a good way to like kind of bump your flies down a tapering gravel bar. So you'll see here, again, got a standard tapered leader down to the first fly. And then we're running about, a foot, 16 inches of tippet to the next fly. And then your bottom section of tippet, I usually do lighter, like really light tippet, like 6x or something down here on the bottom. So that's simply just holding your split shot on there. And what you want is, if that does get hung up, you want it to be able to break away. And that's why I made the suggestion to use tin split shot, or like, shot putty or something down at the bottom. So you just tie a little half hitch knot in the end of that line, and then attach your split shot above that. And it'll ensure your weight doesn't slide off the end, but also if you get it hung up, you don't lose your whole rig. You just break that little tag off with your weight, and then you attach a new one and you move on. This is also a really good place to implement a tippet ring, and you can put those right at the junction where your flies are attached. This is a better way to get a little more life out of your flies when you're doing a drop shot rig. Your flies can kind of freely move around the leader then, and you don't have that weight kind of like pulling it really tight. And so you get a little more natural movement from your rig like that. As far as your standard dry fly rigs, when you're just throwing a caddis pattern or a general mayfly or whatever, your standard dry leader is going to be 9 to 12 feet. I like fishing 4x a lot to my regular dries, unless I'm going to like a straight stonefly or something, in which case I'll fish 2x or 3x. The fish usually don't care. If you have a good imitation and they're hungry, they'll blow right through the 2x. They don't even notice that it's there. And then I did a diagram of my dry dropper leaders. The dry dropper is a rig that I use pretty regularly throughout the summer, even beyond the stonefly hatch. I'll keep throwing a chubby Chernobyl all summer, and sometimes even into the fall, and just use it as a strike indicator. For these kind of rigs, I'm running a shorter leader to the chubby, and you'll find that they're much easier to turn over like that. And so you just do like 6 to 8 feet of 3x, and then send your fluorocarbon off the back of that. In this case, the amount of tippet you have dropping off the back of your large buoyant dry fly is going to depend on how deep you're trying to fish it. But generally I'm fishing 3 to 4 feet to that first fly. And the first fly that I put off the back of the dry rigs, I usually prefer some kind of like tungsten beaded fly. The tungsten Euro nymphs are great. They fish really well when they're hung like that, and they get down really quick. You can find these in a variety of different bead sizes too, so it's good to keep kind of a good variety of those things in your box so that you can determine how quick you want to get down and change up. And then sometimes I'll even run an additional nymph off the back of that Euro nymph. And so you'll have a 3-fly rig running around, and it can get a little messy with 3 flies if you're getting careless and casting too much and whatnot. So just make sure that you're keeping your rig neat. So let's see the next slide here. Streamers and wet flies. I just did a quick diagram to show how, kind of directionally we prefer to fish these. As far as streamers go, I usually like to throw a sinking line, or at least a short sink tip to get the streamer down. Again, it's always going to depend on the water type, but small minnow imitations or leeches are just fine. Woolly buggers, they catch fish everywhere. You can get plenty of fish on a woolly bugger. Small sculpin patterns, though, like your sculpzillas and whatnot, are deadly. They're super effective when they're fished right down there. And so what my diagram shows here is your fisherman, from a fixed foot position. I usually go upstream with a cast, and that way I'm stripping my fly downstream. That's always my initial presentation with a streamer when I'm trying to mimic a fleeing bait fish, is I like to work it down and across. And then I'll throw a cast straight across and work it back to me through there, and then just a downward and across, kind of a classic swing. And then I'll change my foot position, and that way you're kind of getting a few different reveals of the fly to the fish from one foot spot. That's what I've found to be most effective. As far as wet flies go, this can be a really effective technique, especially leading up to, say, like a caddis hatch in the evening. Usually the caddis get going around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and those 2 hours leading up to that, fishing pupa imitations and soft hackles, and a lot of the time on the swing too. You can fish an intermediate line, or just throw it across, let it drop down, and then just kind of tight line it and let it swing through riffles. Super fun way to fish. Works really good. And so for this, like, the diagram just shows kind of more of a cast down and across, sort of your classic swing is the direction you want your fly heading. You want a subtle kind of gradual lift off the bottom. You don't want that fly going too fast. Caddis are teeny tiny little bugs. They don't swim too fast, but they can swim pretty quick. So let's move on to some of the notable hatches of the season. I just want to go through some of the prime bugs that we're going to be looking for throughout the year and some of the highlights. So, the Stonefly hatch, I think this is where the Deschutes has the greatest reputation. A lot of the time I talk to people, they make one trip to the Deschutes every year, and that's sometime in late May to fish the stones. And that's the only time they go down there, and for a good reason. It is the most popular time to be there, most well-known hatch of the year. You can get a lot of big surface strikes, and you can raise some of the biggest fish out of the river in broad daylight. Like, there doesn't need to be any special hatch or any special timing. You just have to find a fish that's in the mood and is looking up, and they'll do that right in the middle of the day when the sun's out. And it's kind of a really unique situation. Of course, the fish is better during low light, but when the stones are going on, I'm fishing a stone all day, every day on the surface, just because it's kind of like, going for topwater bass. It's all about that surface explosion. It's super fun. That hatch will start in April, late April. I think that's something not a lot of people realize, but when you're clear down at the mouth or down in Maupin, you'll start seeing stoneflies crawling around in the last week of April. And it'll go all the way into June. So that second, third week of May is usually like your prime, like peak days to be fishing the stonefly hatch. But every year it's a little different. It could go for a couple weeks if it's really hot and dry conditions. Those fish the bugs will emerge and they'll mate, and then they'll lay eggs and die, and they just do it like that. But you could have some inclement weather, say like prolonged rainstorms like we had last year, and I saw that. I saw stoneflies crawling around all the way into mid-June, like the second week of June. There was still bugs crawling around, and just that cooler, wetter weather will kind of delay them, makes them more lethargic, so they linger a little longer and take some more time to get the job done. So a lot of these stoneflies are in their nymphal stage for 1 to 4 years, their larval stage. So I think that's it's a notable thing to recognize, that there's always stonefly nymphs in these rivers, and they're always around for the fish. Leading up to the hatch, they'll make a migration to the bank, and that's also a great time to fish nymphs, in those last weeks of April or first week of May. Here's a couple of pictures of some stoneflies. The photo on the left is an emerging stone, so this is one that I got a picture of. You can see him pulling out of his nymphal shuck. These bugs crawl all the way up onto the bank grasses and sometimes like bases of trees before they break out of their nymphal shuck. It's really cool to see. The photo on the right is a mating cluster. When they're starting to mate and there's plenty of them around, you'll see these just like absolute balls of stoneflies on the bank grasses and stuff. Here in this picture is actually salmon flies and golden stones, getting a little confused about who they are. So it's kind of a cool shot. Your stonefly imitations, as far as the drives go, there's a million patterns out there. These are the two that are like, don't leave home without them. One is your chubby Chernobyl. It's a very buoyant fly. It floats all day. You can hang droppers underneath it. And it's also just got an awesome profile, great imitation for stoneflies and for hoppers as well later in the season. And then the Clark Stone is one of those classic flies you know, it's kind of like, it's a hare's ear. It's been around forever, but it's deadly effective. It's one of my favorite stonefly imitations. My box is loaded with them at the beginning of the season, so bring those along. Green drakes. Green drakes are definitely an overlooked hatch on the Lower Deschutes. We hear about green drakes on the Upper D and green drakes on the Metolius, but nobody ever gives the drakes on the Lower D the time of day. And I think it's just because they're usually coming off in the same season as the stoneflies. You know, May through June is when you're going to see a lot of the drakes. And you don't see a whole bunch of them. You'll see sporadic drakes around on the river, but on an overcast day or a rainy day, they will go, they'll hatch really hard, and the fish don't ignore them at all. I mean, I've seen times where fish are just blowing up all over the place, and right in the middle of the stonefly hatch, and you can throw stonefly in there and they just absolutely ignore it. They're just dead focused on eating all these drakes. So if you're down there for the stonefly hatch, definitely bring some drake imitations with you. And you know, that it can be just as much, even more fun than the stoneflies, just because they can the fish actually get into a rhythm, and you just go fish for fish constant, you know, while those things are coming off. Here's a couple of my favorite drake patterns. I usually fish stuff with deer hair. Again, I want something that's going to be buoyant. It's going to ride around on the rougher water that we find on the Lower D. So your hair-winged drakes and this green drake cripple with the forward tide deer hair like that. If you are going to fish in a cripple imitation, I love these things. They've got really kind of lifelike marabou abdomen that hangs in the water. Super cool pattern. Caddis, I'd say caddis are definitely the largest hatch that we find down there. And I mean, there's a bunch of different species. Some of the primary species that we take note of down there would be the green caddis, which is one of the larger caddis species. It's actually a free living caddis. You guys may have heard of green rockworms or the Rhyocophila. And this is one that we'll see through the peak months of the summer. So you also have the spotted sedge, granums, which is your Mother's Day caddis. So those will start in, you know, around April and May, and they'll go for a long time too, most of the way through the summer. Glossosoma is a net building caddis, and then you have your Octobers also. Caddis, you don't really need to know all these different species. Just get some elk hair caddis, some X caddis, have them in different variations and sizes and colors. You can mimic pretty much every caddis fly out there. They all behave pretty much the same. You know, they all kind of pupate the same, and you know, egg laying stages and whatnot, they're all really similar to each other. Yeah, and so they'll start in April. You know, you're going to see the tail end of some of these smaller caddis species and the October caddis all the way into November. And here's a picture of a couple of my faves. The X caddis with the trailing shuck is a great kind of emerging caddis pattern, you know, sort of trapped in its nymphal shuck, vulnerable fly. The missing link is definitely a don't leave home without it sort of caddis pattern. It's got this nice spent wing, you know, crippled caddis look. Also is a good imitation for, you know, aquatic moths, which we see a lot of on the Lower Deschutes. And then pale morning duns, you know, this is one of our more consistent hatches throughout the year. Definitely the longest hatch next to caddis. But you're going to see them from May through September. They inhabit, you know, mostly in weed beds and kind of the woody, leafy substrate on the bottom. And so a lot of the time on the Lower Deschutes, you'll find these big, long weed beds, and you can have some amazing, amazing dry fly fishing off the back end of these things. You can imitate every stage of this hatch pretty much throughout the summer. So bring nymphs, bring emergers, bring dry flies, spinners. When they're around in the summer, the fish are looking for them at all times of day, just in different stages. So good bugs. Here's one of my favorite PMD emergers down there. Again, a forward tied deer hair wing, nice and buoyant, has a good, I like the way these flies sit in the water with their butt down. And then the tilt wing PMD, great fly to, it's just got an awesome profile, buoyant. It's a good one to kind of skate around a little bit also, if you find fish looking for a little extra motivation. And then here's a photo of a PMD nymph, just to kind of give you guys a general idea of profile and color. Split case PMD is probably one of my favorite nymphs to mimic those guys. You can always just use like a, flashback pheasant tail, though, is kind of one of those classics that is kind of a do-all nymph, works great. To conclude my presentation, don't buy into the slander, or somebody tells you, oh, don't go down to the Lower Deschutes because it's slippery down there, there's too many snakes, you're gonna get washed away, whatever. It's a great place to fish. It's safe and it's pleasant as long as you use your head and you're smart about where you're waiting and whatnot. And it's right down the road from you guys. It's an hour and a half away. One of the better native trout streams in the Pacific Northwest. So get out there and enjoy it, you guys. That's about it. And then here's some trout porn for you guys to enjoy at the end of the presentation. Oh man. Well,
That was
Rainey,
great, Bryon. Mike's telling me I need to find a dog sitter so that we can go on one of your multi-day trips.
All right.
But, there's like a short list of 2 people I trust with Henry, so.
Well, Sarah should still be on that list.
So I don't know if you guys saw it, but Bryon had his contact info on the last slide before the fish porn, but I can get you in touch with him, or I think his contact info is in the last e-news that went out, and it'll be on our website along with this recording here. Phil's in charge of that. I'm not good at that, but he'll have it up shortly, I think.